Today's presentation is God Undocumented, a look at immigration foundations, justice and reform. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Federalist Society and the Murphy Institute. Just a couple housekeeping tips before we get started. Our program is going to be live streamed and recorded, and the recording will be available on the Murphy Institute website after the event. 1 CLE credit has been approved for this event. Sign-in will be available out there by the food. For those in person, you need to provide your attorney number. Zoom participants should email their attorney number over to Murphy, INSTIT @stthomas.edu. That will also be added to the Zoom chat. During the Q&A, Zoom participants can submit their questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Again, this will be noted in the chat. And then there is a class in this room at 1:30, so we'll have to make sure we end promptly at 1:25. As people who have been to these lunchtime talks, the time goes by fast and there's a lot to cover. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our lovely guest panelists here. We have Mr. Michael Scaperlanda. Professor Scaperlanda is currently Chancellor of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City and Professor Emeritus at the University of Oklahoma School of Law. Since joining the faculty in 1989, he has served as Associate Dean for Research and as Chair of numerous committees. Professor Scaperlanda's scholarship includes work on immigration law, and one of which was co-edited by UST Law's own Professor Teresa Collette. Professor Scaperlanda's articles have appeared in a number of journals on topics such as the confluence of religion, ethics, and immigration law. And then next we have UST's Law's own Professor Virgil Wiebe. Professor Wiebe is the director of the Immigration Clinic at the University of St. Thomas. For 19 years, he has served as co-director of UST's Interprofessional Center for Counseling and Legal Services, which is a multidisciplinary effort to provide legal, social work, and psychological services to underserved individuals and communities. Professor Wiebe and his students have represented asylum seekers, victims of crime and human trafficking, immigrant detainees, and persons seeking naturalization for nearly 30 years. So welcome, and we'll kick it off with Professor Scaperlanda. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. This is, for most of my academic career, this was kind of my home away from home. I'm a little bit afraid to talk about these foundations with Professor Berg here because I'm going to talk about constitutional law a little bit. And some of you probably don't know Professor Susan Stabile, who's here, and I'm probably missing a couple others, but it's great to be back here. Oh, there's another one. Yes. So great, wonderful to be here. I had planned this for springtime, and I don't know what happened to spring. I thought I was going to bring it with me, but I didn't do that.
This is short sweat.
This is short sweat. Not for somebody who's been in Oklahoma for a long time. So you probably never learned in constitutional law that people could be excluded from the country, even people that have lived here for 12 years could be excluded in the country because of their race. Or that you could lock somebody up who'd lived in the United States for 25 years. You could lock them up forever without a trial, right? Anybody hear that? Anybody learn that in common law? So the US Supreme Court has what they call the plenary power doctrine. And the Chinese exclusion case, which is still cited by federal courts today. It was cited at least twice last year. I actually went on Westlaw to look at that. Chinese exclusion case, Che Jinping, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, lived in the United States for 12 years in the late 1800s, wants to go back and visit his family in China. And of course, in those days, it takes a long time. And so you go for a year, you come back. The US is becoming sort of anti-Chinese by that time, and they're not letting new Chinese immigrants come in. He gets a certificate from the United States government saying he's entitled to come back. Now, he's not a US citizen, and he can't be a US citizen because we have a whites only citizenship rule. By that time, blacks could become citizens too, because it's after the Civil War. But the Chinese could not naturalize until the 1930s. So he can't become a citizen and have that protection. So he's been here for 12 years, goes back home, and he has a certificate from the US government saying he can come back. While he's on the boat coming back, the US government revokes those certificates. And so he gets here, arrives at Angel Island, which is the Ellis Island of the West, and he's not permitted entry. Goes up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says he's got no right to come in. This is a sovereign nation, and we would lose some of our sovereignty if we couldn't decide who we wanted in. And if there's a group, a racial group that we think can't assimilate with us and can't be part of us, we have a right to exclude them. Again, this is an opinion that's been cited at least twice in the last 12 to 15 months by the US Supreme Court. The second case, Meziai case, or Meziai, I don't know how you pronounce the case. The guy and I hate to have this as an epitaph. Justice Jackson, in his opinion, said that this guy lived a life of unrelieved insignificance. It's a little bit arrogant of Jackson to conclude that too, but a life of unrelieved insignificance. So lives in Buffalo, married to an American citizen, has citizen kids. After World War II, he goes to try to see mom in what's becoming behind the Iron Curtain, so Eastern Europe. He gets stuck there for a couple of years as he's coming back, and is told he can't come back into the United States because he is a dangerous person, national security threat. And so his lawyers say, well, tell us what evidence you have. Well, that would violate national security to tell you what evidence we have against him. And so he's welcome to stay at Ellis Island. Now, I don't quite understand the problem here. I think I'd rather live by myself reading books on Ellis Island, looking out over the New York Harbor, than live in Buffalo. But anyway, he wanted to go home to Buffalo for whatever reason. And so he was free to stay in Ellis Island. They weren't processing people, so he's a prisoner there. But they wouldn't let him into the country. And this goes up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said he's got no right to come back. And by a split decision, they said he's got no right to know what the evidence is against him, because he's not here. He's not in the United States, or hasn't been admitted in the United States. So anyway, I like to sort of turn constitutional law upside down sometimes with that. Now, where did the US Supreme Court get this? Is this in our Constitution? And the answer is no. I mean, what they're basically saying is, and what the court in the 1800s was saying is, this is a matter of the law of nations, national sovereignty. And I've got two questions that I want to explore with that very quickly so we can get on to other topics. This is sort of the foundational piece. One is, does our Constitution itself limit our conception of sovereignty? And I don't really want to explore it, but I want to throw that out. I mean, it could be that the law of nations allows nations to make these decisions, but we in our Constitution limit that action. So that's an interesting question, but I don't have time to really go into that today. The other question I want to explore is, and this gets with the Murphy Institute and Catholic social teaching, is this what the law of nations really said? And here the court, I think, gets it wrong, or gets it half right, but wrong in a horrible way. And that is, if you look back at the law of nations, so this problem of immigration really comes up after the rise of the nation state and the peace at Westphalia. Now we've got these new nation states, and do they have a right to exclude? Do people have a right to emigrate with an E? Do they have a right to immigrate into certain places? All those questions come up. And so the early international law scholars, law of nations scholars, Grotius, Pufendorf, Vattel, all were addressing these questions. And what they said, in the court in later cases cites these authors as authoritative, but they cite them for half of what they say and not the other half. So what these authors said is that nations do have a qualified right to exclude, not an absolute right. So the court made it an absolute right. What the scholar said is nations have a qualified right to exclude. I mean, obviously to protect themselves, but also part of that protection might be, well, we just can't take in more people. because of our economic situation or our political situation. But it's a qualified right, not an absolute right. They also said that everyone has an absolute right to emigrate with an E, to leave their country of origin if they need to leave in order to flourish as a human person. And so if you really look at it, and I don't know from a constitutional standpoint how you solve the puzzle, but the way the court solved it was not the right way. But we as the wealthiest country in the world have a greater obligation to receive people than other countries do that have more limited means. And so but when the court set up this absolute sovereignty, it set up our kind of cultural mentality of, at least legal mentality, we can exclude, and we can exclude for whatever reason we want, whenever we want. Anyway, I think that's what I want to say at the beginning.
Okay. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and really bring a bit of a faith perspective to this, and I'll be coming from a particular place in history and in sort of the landscape of religion in the United States, and that is from the perspective of being a Mennonite. And for those of you who don't know, the Mennonites are part of the historic peace churches of Quakers, Mennonites, Church of the Brethren. They were part of the 16th century Radical Reformation, which had at least 4 distinctives: adult baptism, which at the time was considered heretical and treasonous. That's where the name Anabaptist, which is sort of an overarching term for this movement, comes from. It means rebaptizing, and it was kind of an epithet. A second distinctive is pacifism. A third is really a flattened hierarchy of church structures, that the source of power and community in the church was the church itself, the people of the church having a major role in that. And then along with that, really a community interpretation of scripture. So I'm just going to jump in and share maybe some principles that come out of that tradition. And to echo my colleague, that includes the right to stay, the right to leave, and the right to arrive. And now I'm just going to list off sort of 6 principles that go along with that. First, migrants bear God's image. We encounter God in the face of refugees, asylum seekers, and other migrants. Secondly, the incarnation of Christ brings dignity and solidarity to the migrant and displaced. Jesus himself was a migrant in a very real sense. He was homeless. He claimed that he had no place to lie his head, and he was stateless, saying that my kingdom is not of this world. So in a sense, we can say that Christ was undocumented. And I'm sharing this notion of God being undocumented. I have to credit Matthew Caldwell and Ched Myers, who wrote a book in 2012 called Our God is Undocumented. I highly recommend that. Third, we are all temporary residents. We learn about the nature of God and ourselves in the migrant experience. Fourth, hospitality. We are called to welcome the stranger among us by demonstrating love and empathy and practicing hospitality. In Genesis 18, Abraham and Sarah welcomed 3 strangers, often seen as representatives of the Trinity. So it's also interesting that the word for hospitality in Greek is philoxenos, or love for the foreigner, which is the opposite of xenophobia. The English word hospitality comes from the Latin word hospitalis, which is a room set aside for a guest, or hospice, which is translated as host, stranger, and foreigner. So it's interesting that it's got both the idea of host and stranger built into it, that there's sort of a mutuality there. We should be hospitable, but also to receive the hospitality of our guests. Fifth, God's special concern for the poor and oppressed calls on us to see, serve alongside, and advocate with the most vulnerable people who face disproportionate risk due to their forced migration and displacement journeys. Most of you have heard the passage from Leviticus 19. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. One author has even gone so far as to see Jesus not only as undocumented, but as the good coyote. And for those of you who are familiar, coyotes are human smugglers, that Jesus cast his lot with the outcast, with those who were sort of seen as outside the bounds of society, and really tried to get them into the beloved kingdom. Finally, and this may go a little bit to the professor's reflection on the United States as really being the most powerful country in the world, we are called to confess and to be renewed concerning ways we have unfairly benefited and contributed to systems that bring about displacement and oppress the migrant. So again, I have really pulled these principles from the Relief and Development wing of the Mennonite Church called Mennonite Central Committee, who has sort of boiled these things down. So I think that's where I'll stop for this portion and hand back over.
Oh, thank you. We'll try to fight at some point to give it a little juice. So one of the things I forgot to, I said I was going to talk about these Law of Nations scholars, and I brought the Murphy Institute in it, and then I never said how that fits, and I think your faith perspective. So anyway, it was in my head, but it just didn't get in my voice. And that is these Law of Nations scholars are all arise out of scholasticism. And some of them were Northern European Protestants, but they were relying upon the Catholic Church philosophical view out of the Spanish scholastics. And so Professor Wiebe was talking about the Bible and Leviticus and other passages. So that's the biblical aspect of it. There's also a natural law aspect of it too, a philosophical aspect that's rooted in the Christian tradition. And so that's what these natural law scholars were really coming at it from that philosophical perspective. But they also would have agreed with the biblical perspective too, the theological perspective. But one of the problems with, and this is what the problem arose after the peace at Westphalia, is we don't all agree on what the Bible means anymore. And whether churches ought to be hierarchical or flat, right? And so that's where the Spanish scholastics and then these other scholastics were writing in this natural law thing. Is we struggle with how to talk in biblical language when we're all fighting each other across Europe on this. But I think that the two things go hand in hand. Is that here we are as a nation that is, I won't say it was a Christian nation. It's a complicated nation. It's a complex nation as it arose at a particular time in the history of Western thought with the Enlightenment and right before the French Revolution and all that. So it's complicated. But we certainly had this Christian, both philosophical and theological, cultural underpinning, and the court sort of rejected that or didn't fully flesh that out in these cases. And what we have, what I see anyway, is a tension throughout our immigration history between the Chinese exclusion case and absolute sovereignty and Emma Lazarus's poem, "Give me you're tired, you're hungry, and you're poor." And there's that tension there between those two sides that has been there from the beginning. Now we've got, I think, our system is broken, and I'm not, it's not just Biden's fault, or it's not just Trump's fault. It's been going on for a long time. The modern iteration of its brokenness, I would take back to 1986. So in 86, we had about 4 million undocumented people in the country, and and a Republican president and a Democratic Congress passed and signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. Everyone involved said, we need to solve our immigration problem. We need to have a healthy front door of good, healthy legal immigration, because undocumented immigration is not good for anybody. It's not good for the rule of law. Some would argue, I think that's probably true to some extent. It's not good necessarily for the vulnerable populations that are already here. And it's also not good for the undocumented. And I'll tell you a personal story. Our HR director at the Archdiocese had a stroke, and she was out, and I was her boss, and somebody came to me and said, somebody just applied for a job at one of our parishes who's got the same Social Security number as somebody who works in your kitchen. And I figured out how to go on E-Verify, which she did, and figured out that immigration authorities had said we need to follow up with this kitchen worker. So I called him in and I said, hey, what's going on here? And he said, well, can I stay the rest of the day, or do you want me to leave now? And I said, you can stay the rest of the day. But you know, he lives like that all the time. Always wondering when the gig's going to be up and he's going to have to go find another job. And he apologized to me. I said, you don't need to apologize to me. I mean, you're doing what you need to do for your family, but I can't employ you anymore. And he understood that. So it's not good for the undocumented either. So in 1986, Congress and the president decide, and President Theodore Hesburgh at Notre Dame headed up an independent commission that was appointed by Carter to kind of look at this. And this is what they came up with also. We're going to grant amnesty to many of the 4 million that are here. We're going to impose employer sanctions on employers that hire and retain undocumented in the future. If you've had a job, you filled out an I-9 form where you have to prove who you are and that you're authorized to work here. That comes out of that bill. And so then we're going to have, you know, kind of increase our numbers of legal immigration. That was an abysmal failure. And so, you know, by the end of George W.'s term in office, there were over 12 million undocumented in the country, so 3 times as much. And so why did it fail? I think it failed, and I don't know if Professor Wiebe's got a different thought on this, but I think it failed for 2 reasons. One, I think we can take care of, and that is we didn't have the technology at the time to verify people's employment status in the United States. Now with E-Verify, I think we can, as I just demonstrated, check on people's employment status, and there'll be some failure rate, but as long as there's some play in there to not dump people before we see the failure rate, you know, that this person really is authorized, I think that would work. So one, I think we have technology today that could help with employer sanctions in a way that we didn't. The other problem is lack of will. It turns out neither Republicans nor Democrats really want to kick people out of the country too much. And neither did a very good job of rounding up and deporting. You know, it was interesting at the beginning, George W. was he didn't do much deportation until he wanted comprehensive reform at the end of his administration. And then he started enforcing the laws. And so I don't know if we have a lack of will, but one of the problems that we got into, I mean, now our politics is there's a whole nother set of issues with it. But during the early 2000s, the House Republicans were saying, hey, you fooled me once, we're not going to go for this twice. George W. wanted to do immigration reform. House Republicans said, we're not going to do it because you're just not going to enforce this. We're going to give amnesty to 12 million people. And then in 20 years, we'll have another 12 million or 20 million here. So so we've got a problem, I think. It's not healthy for anybody. So here's my 3-pronged solution. And it's got to be, I think, all 3 prongs. And so this actually gets into a discussion I'd like to have, and that is, okay, we're called to treat the alien among us as a citizen. So if you're here already, do that. We're called to be hospitable, but how should we be hospitable? I mean, and maybe you're an open borders person, we can talk about that. But assuming that we've got borders and that we're not going to let everybody in, you know, how do we manage our immigration? And can we, you know, kind of philosophically or theologically, can we have borders? And I think we can, and we can get into that more. But I would take a three-pronged approach. First, I would grant, I don't know what, if amnesty is a dirty word, we can call it something else, I don't care, but grant some path to citizenship to most of the people who are here and built their life. If they've been here a long time and they've built a life, and they're not major criminals, and but they're just trying, like my kitchen worker, just trying to get along and make a better life for their family, figure out some path to regularization and later citizenship for those folks. Then we need to figure out a way really to close the border to undocumented, because the worst thing you could have is in 10 or 12 years, have another 4 million, 10 million, whatever. And then we're faced with the same crisis, and we're not going to do this a third time. So we've got to figure out a way to do that. You know, you could build big walls. Somebody said if you wanted to build a big wall, I would invest in the boat building business in Mexico. Just take a boat. So you could build a wall, but it seems to me that most people come here for work. And so having true employer sanctions, so upping the fines, but having true employer sanctions and enforcing it would be a way to put it not on the undocumented, but put it on the employer to do this. And we could argue about that, but that's where I think I would put a lot of it. And then the third prong is to have a system for good legal immigration or non-immigrant workers. You know, I think we were talking earlier about Romans 13 and, you know, obey the law. And somebody on a talk I gave one time said, you know, these are lawbreakers. And I said, and I'll talk about Aquinas, even though I said I wasn't going to, but I said, well, there's a couple of problems with this for unskilled workers. And I think this is still the same, 10,000 unskilled workers a year for immigrant. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. But the line, the last I kind of calculated this, the line is over 1,000 years long. Assuming most of the illegals undocumented or unskilled and that they get first in line, they'd have to wait 1,000 years for the last one's number to come in. I don't plan on living 1,000 years, so not even 100. But so there really is no legal line for most of these folks, but that's one argument I hear is they ought to just do this legally, get in the legal line. There's not a legal line that's long enough for most of them. The other thing is we ought to have, I would have a guest worker program that would ebb and flow with the economy. So when we need those workers, and there's some issues with that we could get into, but ebb and flow with the economy. And then with the guest worker program, I would have, I'm ambivalent about which choice, but you have to have one or two choices, I think. One is they're in here for 3 years and then they have to leave for a year or two. Because they truly are guest workers and you don't want them putting down roots here. Their roots stay in their home country and they come for 3 years and they're gone. So I think it would be bad to have a permanent non-immigrant population here that has no path to citizenship. Or the other thing is there's some path to citizenship for them, and I'm ambivalent between those two. But either bring them in as guest workers and then they can move towards citizenship, or bring them in as guest workers and have them really be guests. But anyway, I'm going to turn it back to you. And how do we treat these, the undocumented that are here, the non-immigrants that are here legally, and whatever else you want to talk about?
All right. So 1986 is definitely an important point in our immigration history. And it's always good to personalize it. I graduated from college in 1986, so I'm feeling kind of old. And you were still in high school.
Yeah, no,
So
I was practicing my DC, working on the 1986 legislation.
Okay. But I think we need to go back to 1965 as well. And in 1965, there was another big immigration reform bill that had been brewing for 40 years. Some very positive things. It did away with the National Origins Act, which was racist at its core in terms of who could migrate to this country. It created opportunities for family-based immigration. But one thing it also did is it changed the quota system. It didn't obliterate the quota system, but it changed it. It actually created quotas for Latin America where there had not been such quotas before. And so that is part of sort of whereas immigration from Latin America to the US prior to 1965 was easier, that change made it much harder. And as we have subsequently built walls, both legal and physical, that make it harder to get in, that also has ironically kept people in. So what am I talking about? In 1996, there was another reform, not nearly as sweeping as 1986, but there was a law that said, if you've been in the country for over a year, undocumented, and you leave the country, you can never come back, or you have to at least 10 years outside of the country. And this law was passed to scare people out of the United States. There was sort of a transition period where this law isn't going to apply to you if you leave. And so there was this sense of, we're going to scare people out of the country. Well, it didn't. It froze them in place. So while for a big part of our history, labor from Mexico would flow into the United States when there was demand, flow out when there wasn't, now we were creating these rigidities that just froze things in place and made it difficult to have that sort of semi-permeable membrane. In addition, Michael, you mentioned the idea of, well, there was an amnesty in 1986, and if we do a second one, if we don't do it right, there won't be a third. But I would suggest that the registry program that has probably 4 times in the 20th century been renewed was an amnesty program. And so we have done this before, and we have done it every 10 or 15 or 20 years. And we've done that without without harsh enforcement pieces to it.
Or under the radar. So
I would just encourage us to look even a little bit further back than 1986. And I'm going to really shift gears here and talk about sort of the reality on the ground right now. The chance of some sort of comprehensive immigration reform happening, at least in the next 2 years, are 0. They were a little bit higher than that when the Biden administration came in, but not much. And so what we also need to do is look at what are states and localities doing to make people welcome. And to do that, recognizing, as with the worker that you encountered, that people, not all immigrants, of course, but some immigrants live in this liminal state of they are here, but they're not welcome. They don't have status. But at the same time, depending on the jurisdiction you live in, there may be a form of welcome that is offered to you. And maybe to make it a little starker, I think in terms of a liminal heaven and a liminal hell, and maybe there's some what's the in between that doesn't exist?
it doesn't exist. Purgatory.
Purgatory. I thought
We can fight about that.
I thought purgatory had kind of been
No, it's still.
nudged aside. All right. But if I can figure out how to pull up some
I'll
slides.
I'll have a few thousand years there, so I'm prepared.
Okay, all right. I'm supposed to share my screen. There we go. So in terms of state and local level, welcome or not, we can think about it really in terms of either things that are enforcement based, sort of negative in terms of your sort of legal and immigration safety on the one hand, and on the other to think about sort of benefits that states and localities offer to folks. So this is a map of local entanglement with immigration and customs enforcement. And I've taken the term straight from Immigrant Legal Resource Center, which is the source of this, a immigration advocacy and defense operation that is in California. And what they've done is looked at sort of the level of cooperation between local law enforcement or state law enforcement and immigration and customs enforcement. So, for example, there's something called a 287G agreement in which state and local officials can basically be deputized by immigration and customs enforcement to work to deport people that they encounter in law enforcement. And as of January of this year, there were 139 of these agreements with local or state law enforcement agencies in 24 different states, often sheriffs or police departments or departments of correction. Texas, well, North Carolina has 15 of these, Texas 26, and Florida 48, to give you a sense of that, of the numbers there. I'm switching to a map from the Center for Immigration Studies, which is seen, well, I think would claim the mantle of a immigration restrictionist nonprofit, and their map maybe isn't as fancy as the other map, but you get the same sort of feel from it. And here we have the term sanctuary as a really used as an epithet, that sanctuary is a bad thing. So this is sort of the idea of individual jurisdictions, apart from federal immigration law, can offer forms of protection to individuals and communities. Additionally, there are sort of benefits or social goods that localities and states can offer. And this is from a recent article in the Chronicle of Higher Education. And it's the issue of access to higher education in public institutions. And you can see that in some states, it's very difficult, if not impossible, for undocumented to get into public higher institutions. In Minnesota in 2013, there was a law passed to allow this, or to allow actually state aid for persons in higher ed in Minnesota. So this is just another example. More recently, Minnesota earlier this month passed legislation, and the governor signed it, allowing undocumented folks to get driver's licenses. Often people are afraid because if they get pulled over, it might lead to deportation. And so now there are 19 states and the District of Columbia that offer driver's licenses to all. And I could go forward. There are other things like perhaps extending health insurance professional licenses. I'll just end with a quote about South Carolina. South Carolina restricts undocumented immigrants, even those with deferred action, from getting professional licenses in over 40 fields. We haven't even gotten into state coalitions that sue the federal government to enjoin federal actions, but we'll do that next year.
I think we're ready.
Ready for questions, yeah.
The kind of want to bring in like almost a Jewish voice, speaking about
Great.
the Holocaust, thinking about the Exodus. So thinking about asylum, war and crisis, people who are running away. How do your religious traditions inform your thoughts about openness to people who are in fear?
I think very open, also a lot of soul searching after World War II. And whether or not we as a church, we as a nation, we weren't open enough. We were very much closing the door to refugees. But yeah, that's a central part of my faith.
And I can report that Oklahoma, and this was the governor and Catholic Charities, we were the highest recipient of Afghan refugees per capita in the country.
Well, what about the border? What about the big question with asylum though right now is on the border, especially in terms of.
Well, so the problem, and so we did a lot of soul searching after World War II. The problem is that most of these folks at the border are not refugees or asylees within the strict definition. Well, we could argue about that, but people who are caught in conflict just in the middle, two bad guys fighting at each other, and you're caught in the middle, you're not a refugee under that definition. If your country's in economic crisis and drought, you don't fit. So the definition that came after World War II fit the World War II Holocaust. It solved that problem, or at least attempted to solve that problem. The problem is, and I haven't checked this in a decade or so, but a decade or so when I checked, there were over 25 million displaced people in the world.
It's more like 60 now.
It's more like 60. I figured it was a lot worse now. Yeah. So people that have had to leave their homes to go someplace else because of that. I do a lot of work in northern Uganda, and in the 90s and in the early 2000s, there's this Joseph Kony guy running around Lord's Liberation Army, and there were people that were displaced into refugee camps within Uganda. There were Ugandans in Ugandan camps for 20 years. Last time I was there, I visited a South Sudanese refugee camp. Most of these folks do not fit the technical definition, but given the numbers, I don't know how. I mean, that's the political problem. Is with 60 million people, we're not going to take 60 million people, and even the Western democracies with their wealth are not going to take in 60 million people. So how do you solve that?
I'll jump in after more questions.
I was just going to jump into some percentages numbers because there's been a population explosion on the third rock from the sun since 1965 or before. And most people don't realize that the United States of America is the third most populous country in the world, only behind China and India. So I'm just wondering about percentages here rather than focusing it on borders from a whether God's documented or not perspective. I mean, there's a lot of people moving conflict in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, right? But the numbers may be different. So I'm just wondering if from a percentages perspective, does that change in the time periods you're saying 1965 for where you started from 1986?
I don't know what the population of the US, somebody can Google that and shout it out to the front in the next.
Yeah.
How many?
350 million.
No, in 1965,
Oh, that's going to be under 200 million probably.
well under 200 million. So if we're talking about percentages, we're a country of, I was going to say 330, you're saying 350. Absorbing another 10 million. It seems like a big number, but relative to our population, maybe not percentage wise that big. And in terms of the border, I mean, we are closing down welcome. There are many of these people who do have valid refugee claims under the definition we hold now. And the current administration is, for lack of a better word, seeking to gut immigration law and procedure. And I think that's shameful.
Raise a question. You know, you both have mentioned, I think, in your own religious beliefs and backgrounds, this idea that we should be welcoming people that are seeking asylum or seeking migration. How do you reconcile the fact that with the, you know, our constitution, you know, immigrants don't have the constitutional rights of due process, etc., that a citizen does? How do you reconcile that with the way our constitution is written and the decisions that have come out of the Supreme Court denying those constitutional rights to immigrants?
I don't.
You don't reconcile, yeah.
I don't reconcile it.
Well, and so, and one thing I usually mention at the beginning of any talk on immigration, for me, immigration policy starts with trying to help put limits on the push factors pushing people away. Because most people don't want to move to the United States and learn a new language and you know, and especially if they're a refugee coming. My wife was born in Cuba. She came over very young, and her parents, you know, in their 30s, left Cuba and left their degrees behind, had to go back to school. Most people don't want to immigrate if they don't have to, or become refugees, obviously. But so the push factor, so part of the 60 million worldwide displaced people is really kind of international affairs and trying to manage that to attempt a more peaceful world so that people don't have to leave there.
Yeah, I mean, the right to stay is important,
Yeah.
but with climate change, there are growing numbers of folks who are moving really as part of
24 degrees.
yeah, compared to a few weeks ago.
I think it was 8 this morning. But
So there are people moving because of climate change as well. Yeah, and being there are things that the United States has done that encourage people to move.
Mhm.
So the recognition of an illegitimate government in Honduras last decade,
Mhm.
you know, that led to a lot of gang violence in Honduras that hadn't been there before.
No, and we bear some responsibility for some of those things, those ills in the world, and like we did with the Afghanis, obviously it's harder for them to get here, so we have to mostly bring them.
Yeah.
But I guess one thing, even apart now, I see your hand there, but want to just propose something. I live in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. We got homeless that walk through. I don't typically take in the homeless. I don't pay for their kids' education. I do give some charitable stuff, but part of a Catholic tradition would be to say part of the way you contribute to the common good is taking care of your own, and that's a way to take care. And so Aquinas would say, you know, if you've got an abundance, that abundance isn't yours. I mean, it technically belongs to you, but it's for the good. But part of having a good society is that I take care of my own. So this gets to the point about how many can we absorb and all that, and how ought we to do it. But I have an obligation to take care of my family, and that contributes to the common good. And to the extent I've got more, I know my regular homeless people that hang out on the corner where I stop every morning, and I talk to them and sometimes give them things. But we're not, we don't have an obligation to solve all the world's problems.
We don't, but I would just take a little bit of an issue about an underlying assumption.
Okay.
About taking care of our own. Well, we've got so many poor in the United States. Why should we take care of refugees as well? And it's almost as if it's a zero-sum game. Whereas, well, maybe we need to take more of that excess in the form of taxes in order to do more good. And the tax, well, I'm not a tax specialist, but it seems like that's all out of whack. And the income disparities, I'm running down a rabbit hole now.
No, that's,
There's
no,
another-
but I was trying to find a little bit of something we could do. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, a lot of pressure on the.
Yeah.
So I appreciate kind of the mentioning of different groups of immigrants, right? So like the idea of like America should be a nation to kind of for a sanctuary for those in need. But also there's also the group of immigrants who like came here lawfully. And then, so for both of those groups, there is a path to citizenship for some of them. But because of the way the system is set up, there's tension among those groups too, even though to Americans, they're all immigrants. So I'm wondering, is there, like, do you see a way that we can possibly solve that? Because with the current system, the setup is kind of, because of limited resources, everyone is fighting for that one, like, you know, like the limited resources. You see a potential solution to kind of do that kind of an issue. And I don't know if I'm making sense.
Go for it.
Okay, so I would say, and so I want to take some issue, and we could explore the tax issue and the government issue and all that for a long time. I once did a talk, it was at the University of Dayton, so another Catholic institution. And I was back in the presenter's room and I was talking to somebody. He said, "Why do you always bring up your faith?" And I told him why. And I said, I said, "Well, what do you owe immigrants? What do you owe your neighbor who's an immigrant?" He said, "Absolutely nothing. I pay taxes for that." So in his view, and I know it's not your view, but in his view, it's give to the government distributes. And I think you're probably more arguing for both but that's a long way of getting to your question. And that is, I think the only way we can do this is in backyard barbecues, at baptisms, at birthday parties. That's where you break those things down. I think the government can't do that. There's always going to be tension between groups, and we live, from my perspective, in a fallen world, and I think that's probably not very debatable empirically. And so we can't make people love each other and get along and not have tension. So that tension gets diffused, I think, over a beer.
Where's my beer?
Yeah, it's 1:30.